Hello, my name is Joey Cross. How are you? I am a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago, and today I'm talking about literature in ancient Egyptian society. Alongside the iconic monuments and images from ancient Egypt, like mummies, temples, pyramids, I hope to convey in this talk something known by specialists and by students of ancient Egypt and the ancient Middle East, that Egyptian literature deserves to stand alongside these as another iconic feature of this civilization. Now, this is a huge topic. My approach today is to plunge right in to consider what we mean by the word literature, and then see if we can recognize it in ancient Egypt by taking a very close look at one most popular work of literature from Egypt, the teaching of Amenemope. So, briefly, what do we mean by literature? Here's a working definition: a collection of verbal works of art that are expressive for the sake of being expressive, serving to entertain, amuse, or enrapture. These often stand for a certain way of looking at or understanding the world. Literature exists for others. It has an audience. It communicates meaning that is of high cultural value. For those outside of that culture, it's available, if we're lucky enough, as evidence for the beliefs or the worldviews of its authors and its audience. Of course, it's a lot more than that. Let's break down the way we actually use the word literature. The word, as we mean it in everyday usage, often really just means great literature. So we treat Shakespeare and Tolstoy as if there's something inherent in them that does not necessarily need full historical context to understand. They can just be read with profit, carefully, because they express profound ideas about what it means to be human, because of maybe some innate genius in their authors. Literature as great literature is a special kind of collection. It's decided on by a culture, explicitly or implicitly. Works that are called great literature come together and are even their own type of literature, their own genre that goes beyond all specific ones, something we would call a canon. Another aspect to the word literature is one that I think underlies a lot of academic and historical perspectives on the ancient world. Similar to the French phrase belles lettres, it refers to any kind of verbal art where there are, to varying degrees, a distinct pleasurable or aesthetic interest in the words themselves, in their communicative aspect and their effect. So looking at ancient literature through this lens means casting our net more widely, noticing texts with literary features that go beyond a more narrow definition like great literature. So, in particular, I'm thinking of religious texts, or texts used for the practice of magic. Also monumental inscriptions. These all have literary features, and we could call them literature. Speaking in more specific terms about ancient Middle Eastern literature, we notice a common, careful use of language in non-mundane texts that we can call parallelism. This is where two or more sentences or utterances, something we could call a poetic line, share similar ideas or phraseology. They repeat them with some variation, or they draw up an explicit contrast. Parallelism seems to be a very prominent feature of verbal art in languages that don't employ meter based on stress in some form. Regular meter, like English poetry, or like classical Greek and Latin poetry. For us, literature is also closely associated with schooling and education, especially the great literature aspect just discussed. And it won't be surprising to hear that literature was important for ancient Egyptian education, as it was for all ancient peoples. There are numerous parallels as well as intriguing differences, though, between our education and theirs. So learning how to read and write, for example, comes at the beginning of our education, or near the beginning. For the ancient Egyptians, this would have been true also, but true mastery of the difficult hieroglyphic script in every form would have taken longer, and full mastery of it would have been reserved for fewer people. Today, speaking more specifically in terms of literature, we associate with education the memorizing and the performing of poems like Edgar Lee Masters' Spoon River Anthology or Robert Frost. This is a separate endeavor from learning how to read and write, something we might do in middle or high school. And this is how we learn how to read closely, how to think about perspective and rhetoric. For the Egyptians, not only learning and even memorizing works of literature, but copying them out, either by memory or by dictation, was a constant and important feature of education. This had a practical good, a practical goal, not only practicing how to write, but learning by heart important phrases, turns of phrase, structures of sentences that they'll use a lot as professionals. Also, internalizing specialized vocabulary. Instead of making flashcards like we do today, they memorized and copied works of literature that use as many creative words as they possibly could. So, beyond all this, beyond this sort of everyday or practical reason to copy and to memorize literature, this was a process of enculturation, a topic that I'm going to discuss a bit more later. A fourth use of the word literature broaches a crucial topic. We often use this word just to mean a bunch of reading material, like brochures, or to refer to, let's say, all of the writing associated with a particular topic. So a thesis or a research paper will have a literature review. So this reminds us that for us today, literature is a matter of writing, of written language. This is not true for all literature. A famous example that's even relevant today is the folk tale. When a collector writes down folk tales, they're transcribing something that, in its natural element, is performed out loud, orally, through improvisation, using a wide-ranging technique based on traditional phraseology, approaches to building scenes, and characters based on storylines that are well known. It might be a bit nonsensical to call oral storytelling or oral verbal art literature, since that word literally invokes the concept of the letter, but it's appropriate. So in today's talk, I'm focusing pretty much exclusively on written evidence of Egyptian literature, on a work that was composed for the first time as written literature, that could be read from a book. But it's important to remember that for all ancient societies, oral literature, like the folk tale, was very important. There's a rich line of inquiry on the interaction of oral and written literature, and the nature of ancient Egyptian and ancient folklore in general. It's also important not to fall into a trap of thinking that oral equals primitive and written equals advanced or civilized. Now, few today would actually use these terms outright, but something of this distinction, this value distinction, is even implied unknowingly when we think about oral literature as existing before writing became widespread and took hold, let's say. That oral literature is maybe more simple, and written literature is more complex because of its very nature. Or that oral literature belonged to lower classes of society, while only the upper crust enjoyed literature and writing. This is not true. It's much more complicated than that. Every work of literature from the ancient world, it's the proverbial tip of the iceberg of an entire world of verbal art and of verbal artistry and artists that included in its orbit writing as one mode of expression. So, what did ancient Egyptian literature actually look like? So what was copied and read? Now, we associate literature with books, but the Egyptians had, technically speaking, scrolls. One of the most important writing media in the world that they, in fact, invented. So, to make a scroll, the fibrous center of the papyrus plant, which grew plentifully in Egypt, was peeled into strips. These strips were laid side by side and then rolled or beaten. That caused the strips to exude a kind of natural glue that made them stick together, and this allowed them to create continuous flat surfaces that were perfect for writing. In this way, Sheets of papyrus could be produced and then stuck or mashed together themselves, just like the individual strips were. This then creates a long surface. The combination of several sheets of papyrus made in this fashion, that's what we call a scroll. The strips of papyrus would have been laid out in 2 layers, with the strips on the top layer arranged vertically and the strips on the bottom horizontally. This allowed the sheet to be reinforced. Once the sheets were combined, the final product is a scroll, and it could be rolled up and easily stored. By the way, this scroll I'm showing you here is Greek, but it was produced and used in Egypt. An author typically began writing on the side of the scroll with the horizontal strips, the inside. That's what we call its front, or its recto in technical terms. There's a lot of surviving examples of scribes, our name for professional authors, from ancient Egypt. These show us that one would extend the scroll over your lap and begin writing on the front where the fibers run horizontally. Because Egyptian was typically written from right to left, like Hebrew and Arabic, the author would extend the beginning of the scroll to the place they wanted to start with their right hand and unwind the rolled up portion gradually with their left hand as they wrote. After leaving a blank space at the beginning, the author could start near the top of the papyrus. Now, leaving a margin is important. It's good insurance because there's inevitable fraying that happens at the edges of the scroll that's rolled up, and you can see that here. Since it would be impractical, scrolls meant for frequent reading or recitation, it would be impractical to keep writing leftwards until the end of the scroll is reached. Now, scrolls could be as long as 40 meters. The author would stop after a certain amount of space and continue directly to the left, if you're writing from right to left, and create a new series of lines. This forms rectangular sections of text that we call columns, and columns are the equivalents, or really ancestors, of the modern-day page. So once the bottom of the column was reached, the scribe would advance the scroll a bit, pulling with the right hand and feeding with the left hand, and begin once again at the top after leaving maybe a few centimeters of space. So that's how scrolls were built and how they were inscribed. Egyptian scrolls also employed some helpful features to aid in their use, above all to help them be read out loud. Many used what we call verse points. These were small dots written in red ink that distinguishes them from the prominent black ink of the writing surface. These were added after the scroll was finished, and they were used to demarcate sentence or utterance boundaries. Poetic lines, as we would call them. Now, what I'm showing you here is not a scroll. It is a ostracon, a flake of limestone. This is a piece we actually have in the Oriental Institute. It's a more ephemeral type of writing surface. But here is an example on a papyrus scroll. Using verse points would bring out features of parallelism. A prominent feature, as I said, of much ancient literature. It would break up the running text into a distinct series of thoughts and make for reading and thinking about it easier. So this suggests that Egyptians felt much the same way as we do about literature. Mundane texts like letters, messages, receipts, lists of purchases, and animals to be sacrificed, these would have been read or even scanned just for information. But literature does more than communicate information. The point is the reading experience, the words and the ideas themselves. While some scrolls used a lineation like we're accustomed to seeing with books of poetry where there's one line per line of written text, most did not. That's because papyrus was not cheap. And if you wrote one line per line on the text or on the page, you're wasting a lot of space. Now we're going to see that shortly with Amenemope. Most works of Egyptian literature have survived on scrolls, but unfortunately nearly all of them are very fragmentary, some of them extremely so. We have to remember that unlike collections of literature from cultures that were continually read and copied down in succeeding cultures, down to the present day, like the Bible, classical Greek literature, Indian literature, Egyptian literature was forgotten. We only have what we can rediscover through actual physical retrieval from ruins. So this brings us to the work of literature that we're going to focus on to illustrate these points, known as the teaching of Amenemope. This is a member of one of the most popular and widespread genres of literature from ancient Egypt, something we call the instruction or instructional literature. These were collections of proverbial sayings, maxims, teachings for virtuous living that were clear in their intent, yet at the same time profound in their meaning and in their formulation. They were compiled, formulated in a way to encourage rereading and memorization and continued reflection. If you're familiar with the Old Testament, you already know several instructional works, or works that are like that. The Book of Proverbs, Book of Sirach, or Ben Sira, as it's always also known. Works of Egyptian instructional literature were by and large framed as the real life sayings of an important figure from history. For example, a pharaoh from the past. So this allowed the text, when read, to be connected to a real voice, which means that it was meant to be a simulation of a real situation of speaking, of speaker and addressee, something that happens in life that is then frozen and transferred to the surface of the page, but it can be recreated, brought to life again by the reader. I think of Odysseus offering blood to the shades of the departed in Hades to let them speak again. That's what you're doing every time you read a scroll. Now, a common trope in this simulation is for the speaker in the text to address their child. So, the reader, us, we can play along with this fiction, this simulation, and we can eavesdrop, maybe even step into the role of that child, and then internalize the wisdom spoken by the literary voice, and playing the role of the obedient child, carrying on the parent's wisdom as we make our way in the world. So we can say that the teaching of Amenemope was one of the most popular works of literature in ancient Egypt because of the number of copies that have survived. This shows that it was frequently read and copied, and that it was used in education. So the date of this composition is unknown. Scholars think it could have been written in the New Kingdom, maybe around 1200 BCE or after. The earliest copies of it date later to around 1000 BCE. Now, the most magnificent complete copy of the text is on a papyrus scroll that's currently in the British Museum, number 10474. So this is basically entirely intact. Very, very rare for ancient Egyptian literature. Like most papyri, by the way, it's been cut up into sections. And so what I have here is one section with a couple columns on it. So this copy seems to date to the 26th dynasty or so, around 600 BCE maybe. And that's based on a close analysis of its handwriting. It could be a little bit earlier. This is a luxurious scroll. Note how instead of using verse pointings, they do what we would do if we printed a poetic text, ending the line of writing at every poetic line. So one line of writing corresponding to one line of poetry. This wastes a lot of space, and it means that somebody paid a pretty penny for this scroll. It's also written in a beautiful hand, what we call hieratic. It's a cursive form of the hieroglyphic script. Hieratic was the norm for literary texts. Notice, by the way, how the beginning of each line starts at the seam where the sheets of papyrus were originally pasted together to form the scroll. So Amenemope, as we can call it for short, is organized into 30 chapters with a prologue. The heading of each chapter is written in red for easy reference, as you can see here. Each chapter contains a handful of sayings, maybe as little as 4, up to almost 20 sometimes. Often these have a common theme, but sometimes not really. Now, these chapters would have made good assignments for memorization. Each is pretty short, but contains a nice range of sayings that, independently, chapter by chapter, capture the essence of the whole text. In addition to this scroll, I should say, several other copies have been discovered, and most, if not all of these, are on ephemeral material, like this ostracon that's from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This ostracon contains just the very beginning of Amenemope, and it's written in red ink. It was found with a lot of other ostraca that have brief notes and sort of more ephemeral things written on them. So ostracon is our name for pieces of limestone, broken pots that are used for what we would call scratch paper or sticky notes. So what is this all about? Why did somebody write just the very beginning of Amenemope on what we would call a post-it note? So maybe somebody was dared to reproduce it by memory. Maybe somebody was bragging that they knew all the work and they wanted to show off. Maybe they were just practicing writing. Maybe they were about to create a version of it on a new scroll and didn't want to mess up. You can erase papyrus as you're writing, but it's better if you don't have to. So this might have been a little bit of a practice. Maybe he was a bit rusty. It's fun to speculate, but we could go on and on. So the title of this work is a bit of a tongue twister, Amenemope. That's the name of the legendary speaker of this text, who imparts his wisdom to the one who hears it. So this name, Amenemope, includes the name of the Egyptian god Amen. It's actually a title associated with a particular form of Amen associated with the temple of Luxor. This wasn't the ancient name of the work. It might have been known as the Instruction for Life. This is based on its first line. The Egyptians revered historical sages of the past by name. Imhotep is a great example. Imhotep was the historical vizier or second in command, chancellor, let's say, under the pharaoh Djoser, who built the Step Pyramid in the Old Kingdom. Over time, Imhotep became a legendary figure who was associated with wisdom and with learning. So the same thing could have happened with Amenemope, although we don't know too much about him. But I don't see why the work wouldn't have been known or associated with the name. So calling it Amenemope is actually very well reflective of Egyptian practice. The word instruction actually is appropriate also. So this is a translation of an Egyptian word. We can pronounce it sebayit. It means teaching or instruction or even wisdom. This word is found in the first line of Amenemope. And actually it's found in a lot of instructional literature. So let's actually go ahead and put it up here. Let's quote the beginning of this text. The beginning of the instruction of life, the guide for well-being. This is a nice parallelistic formulation. This is what is found right at the beginning of the scroll. There's no author, no title. It just launches right into words you're supposed to read that bring the text to life. We don't know who wrote this text. It could have been a real historical person named Amenemope. The beginning of the text, like a lot of works of literature in ancient Egypt that are of the instructional type, give background about the speaker, his titles, who he was. We're not sure if this was a real person in history. It seems like it. It could be a literary fiction. Or it could be both. Maybe he was a legendary teacher of the past, like Confucius, who definitely lived, but the collection of his work, I'm thinking of the Analects, were not written by him, but by his disciples later and organized together. Maybe that's what Amenemope was. Unfortunately, it's very hard to know for sure. All we have is this. In the prologue, however, the speaker, Amenemope, is fully fleshed out, flesh and blood, like a real person, and his son is named. And so this text is framed as if it's wisdom that this sage, Amenemope, gave to his son, and now it's recorded for all of us to read. Let's get into some of the main text. Here's maybe a sort of random sampling from chapter 7. Do not set your heart upon seeking riches, for there is no one who can ignore destiny and fortune. Do not set your thoughts on superficial matters, for every man there is his appointed time. Do not exert yourself to seek out excess, and your allotment will prosper for you. It's hard to convey the complex language, the difficult vocabulary of this text in translation that would have added substantially to its appeal. Each of these sayings is given its own line on the scroll, as I've tried to reproduce here, by paragraphing. But notice how each of these lines consists of more than one part, usually two. The first offers a general statement or truism, and the second part adds on to it. It seconds it. It explains it. It nuances it. So again, this is classic parallelism. This is all over the place in ancient Middle Eastern literature. And it's especially apropos as a type of verbal art for proverbial thought, let's say. So these sayings here we might call ethical truth, and it is. And this is the kind of teaching that we can apply to our own lives today. That's not the case as immediately for all of Amenemope. Let's look at another selection. So this is from chapter 13. Do not lead a man astray with reed pen on papyrus. It is the abomination of God. Do not witness a false statement. Don't remove a man from a list by your order. Now, that's good advice, I guess, but this brings to mind for us who is reading this text. These are spoken or written to be read by a professional scribe, someone who draws up accounts for an institution like a temple or a courthouse. Clearly, the Egyptians had a deep sense of the responsibility for somebody who wields a pen. They are responsible for recording debts, what people owe, what people are supposed to be given or paid. They record contracts. They witnessed to oaths. So if somebody witnesses, like draws up in writing and signs off on a false statement, they're presenting falsehood as truth in writing. For the Egyptians, this is worse. This isn't just perjury, it's worse. It's an offense to the gods. Reading and writing for the Egyptians was a divine art. The word for hieroglyphs in ancient Egyptian means God's writing. And writing was not invented by humans, according to the Egyptians. It was bequeathed to them by the gods, sort of like Prometheus's fire. So misusing this divine art, it's literally an abomination of God, as said here. Let's get into some more classic ideas of this text. A central, if not the central theme of the work is the heated man or person versus the silent person. In characterizing these types, the author is especially concerned with the art of speaking as a social phenomenon. Speaking in both conversational settings, also formal settings like law courts, let's say. Somebody who is heated will talk without deliberation, and they're prone to argument. Now, this metaphor of heat is really telling. It describes a person who can't control themselves, who harms others. This is very carefully chosen. Like the Egyptians, actually, we associate heat with the color red. We associate it with cheeks flushed in anger, let's say. We even describe arguments as heated. This would make total sense for the Egyptians also. Beyond that, though, the Egyptians also associated heat actually with venom. So the poisonous bite of scorpions and snakes was described of as a kind of heat that courses through your veins. That would have been present here, and the reader would have picked up on that. Now, the silent person, on the contrary, heeds the warning not to separate your heart from your tongue, as the text puts it. So for the Egyptians, controlling your tongue meant allowing your heart, and for them the heart was the seat of the intellect and the emotion, not just a blood pumper. Being silent meant controlling your tongue and allowing your heart to guide your actions, to work through your body. The heart is considered by the Egyptians to be the seat, to be a place of divine intervention, especially in this time period when this text was written. As this quote says, "Keep firm in your heart. The tongue of a man is the steering oar of a boat, but the Lord of all is its pilot." So the silent person is a conduit of divine influence. The heart of a person is a gift of God. Beware of neglecting it. So Amenemope expresses lots of ethical obligations, and this gives us insight into the everyday life of a scribe who's trained to lead and to manage people. It also gives us a window into the Egyptian worldview. So a strict hierarchy in society is affirmed. One should always be deferential to superiors. Fairness in dealing with courts and in collecting revenue is something that's urged. You also have to show constant concern for the poor. The author also presents a theological and ethical corrective to what we would call ableism. So in chapter 25, the reader is encouraged to remember the frail nature of human life, which is, quote, clay and straw, and not to consider themselves inferior to a person who is disabled. That's because all human affairs, according to the author, are finite, they're all imperfect, and they're doomed to deterioration. As the author says, God is ever in his perfection, people are ever in their failure. So Amenemope's readership was pretty small. We could say maybe 1 to 5% maximum of the population of Egypt. These were professional writers, scholars, bookkeepers, authors that we call scribes. Scribes had to train from a young age. This is because of the difficult task of learning how to write hieroglyphs. It took years and years to master this complex writing system that stood for not just sounds, but words and concepts that had a very traditional and, in some cases, rigid system of writing. So formal schools for scribes probably existed. They would have been associated with temples, perhaps. A lot of scribes also would have been trained by their fathers at home or other caregivers. Instructional literature like Amenemope would have been a real cornerstone of scribal education. As I said earlier, we have the smoking gun of this. We have copies of it that were probably made by students. As discussed earlier, students would copy out passages of works like Amenemope by memory or by dictation. That's how they would learn how to read and write and internalize words, sentences, genres, etc. Besides the linguistic aspect, we have to remember that becoming a scribe meant learning a specific set of manual skills, how to create scrolls, how to inscribe elegant and readable documents. All of this came not just through memorization, but through practice. Again, that's why copying out and writing texts was prized. And that's why we have so many copies of Amenemope, relatively speaking. So we can call it a school text. It's a work of literature, great literature maybe, but it's also a text used for education. So the result of knowing a work of literature like Amenemope forwards and backwards is that the student becomes inculcated with attitudes that are considered important for participating in Egyptian society. Amenemope was particularly popular as a school text because of the way it presents an ideal citizen, somebody who's deferent to authority, careful in the way he speaks. So, again, education is a process not just of professionalization, but of enculturation. So, we can know all of this about this text. What about our experience of it? Do we read Amenemope and think about it as great literature? Does it check the boxes of works of great literature that we associate with the term, whether ancient or modern? A lot of masterpieces of literature from the ancient world do this, I think. I think the best example is the Epic of Gilgamesh. For any reader, Gilgamesh comes across as a complete masterpiece. Reading it is inspiring. It conveys that feeling that I like to borrow from Roger Ebert, the film critic, elevation. He said, great films give you a feeling of elevation. That's what literature does also. I think Gilgamesh especially. A lot of that comes from the shock of entering such a starkly expressed foreign world from us that has similar features that we recognize, similar experiences of the world, hopes and fears, but that is also bizarre and foreign. Amenemope is different. It's not a story, so we can't expect the same sort of dramatic experience with it. For lack of better terms, I would call Amenemope subtle and quiet. It's interior, it's inward-looking, it's reflective. It's a speech that we're supposed to interiorize. Most of it consists of these detachable phrases, these memorable sayings that can be remembered independently. These could have a life of their own, too. So if I were to say, all that glitters is not gold, I could be quoting you something that I think most of us know as a proverb, but that's Shakespeare. That's from The Merchant of Venice. Amenemope is full of things like that. Imagine if Shakespeare was known mostly from the sayings and not from the experience of his plays as a whole. So Amenemope is in many ways different from what we expect of great literature because of the way it's experienced and remembered. But the greatness of the text goes beyond its initial reading and the experience of it being read out loud or even performed. Amenemope is the kind of text that becomes part of you. It creates a dialogue between your heart, as the Egyptians would phrase it, and the figure in the text. Like wisdom itself, deeper reflection on the meaning of the text comes with reflection, remembrance, consulting it at times, understanding in moments of realization what Amenemope meant when you have certain life experiences. So I think that's what all of us look for in great literature, from whatever period. And Amenemope fits squarely in that. So this concludes today's talk. It does not conclude everything important to say about Amenemope. And in fact, I'm going to return to this text and talk about it a bit more for a second talk for the Oriental Institute. That'll be shared in a few weeks. So please stay tuned. In that text, we'll discover another side of literature beyond what we've been talking about, beyond maybe features of individual texts, what they say about ancient cultures. We're going to be looking at the side of allusion, when an author displays knowledge of other works of literature and other authors. So we often think of allusion as something essential about literature. There's a lot of literary movements where allusion was part of what they were, like modernism in English and American poetry. So that's what we're going to discover next time around. And think about how ancient authors thought about allusion and what Amenemope and related texts can say about that. And before I sign off, I put up two suggested readings for you if you would like to read Amenemope yourself and other works of Egyptian literature. These two books are affordable and widely available online and in libraries, so I highly recommend them. If you look at the first one, The Literature of Ancient Egypt, edited by Simpson, make sure you get the most recent edition, which is the 3rd edition. These both contain Amenemope and other works of Egyptian literature. I can't say which I prefer because I use them both a lot. I will say when it comes to Amenemope, I prefer Lichtime. I think her translation is really beautiful and captures it very well. But you really have to read both of them and compare them. So please check those out if you're interested. I really appreciate your attention. I wish you all well, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks virtually. Bye.
For over 100 years, the OI has been a leading research center for the study of ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. Join us in uncovering the past and learn about the beginnings of our lives as humans together. Become a member by visiting oi.uchicago.edu/member.